What if the most dangerous thing happening to New York right now isn't crime or politics or even the cost of living, but the fact that its core systems are quietly failing while almost no one is truly paying attention? This is the question most people instinctively avoid because it forces an uncomfortable realization. Collapse doesn't always arrive with sirens, headlines, or sudden disaster. Sometimes it arrives disguised as routine. New York is still standing. The lights are on. Trains are running. Airports are open. Hospitals are operating. On the surface, everything appears functional. And that's precisely the problem. The systems that keep this city alive are not collapsing in a dramatic, cinematic way. They are eroding slowly, invisibly, beneath the weight of neglect, overload, mismanagement, and normalization of dysfunction. And because life technically goes on, most people convince themselves that nothing is fundamentally wrong. But ask anyone who actually lives here. Not Ando, the version of New York sold in movies, marketing campaigns, or Instagram reels, and a different picture emerges. Daily life feels heavier, more exhausting, more fragile. Commuting no longer feels like movement through a world-class city, but like navigating a stressed, overstretched machine that could fail at any moment. Waiting has become a way of life. Waiting for trains, waiting for doctors, waiting for housing approvals, waiting for systems to respond. And often, they never do. This is how large cities truly decline. Not through a single catastrophic event, but through the quiet accumulation of small failures that compound over time. Each delay, each breakdown, each workaround becomes accepted as just how things are now. People adapt, expectations shrink, standards fall, and the city continues operating in a diminished state that no longer matches the image it projects to the world. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that New York still carries enormous symbolic power. It is marketed as resilient, unstoppable, eternal. That narrative acts like a shield against scrutiny. If a smaller city showed the same warning signs, the alarm would already be ringing. But New York's reputation allows systemic decay to hide in plain sight. Public systems are supposed to do one essential thing: reduce friction in daily life. They exist so that individuals don't have to fight everything alone. When those systems weaken, the burden doesn't disappear. It shifts onto people's bodies, minds, and time. Stress becomes chronic. Anxiety becomes ambient. Survival becomes individualized. And slowly, life in the city stops feeling like living and starts feeling like constant management of risk and exhaustion. The most unsettling part is not that these systems are under strain. That happens in every major city. It's that the strain has become permanent and no longer triggers urgency. When collapse becomes routine, it stops looking like a crisis and starts looking like normal life. That's the threshold New York is approaching right now. And once a city crosses that line, recovery becomes far harder than anyone expects. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and think about what you're actually hearing here. Not as theory, not as headlines, but as lived reality. These systems don't collapse in isolation. They collapse around real people, real routines, real lives. And understanding that difference is critical. If this resonates with you, if any part of this feels familiar, unsettling, or uncomfortable, I want you to say it out loud in the comments. Even something simple like, "I see it too," or "this feels real," matters more than you think. Engagement isn't just an algorithmic signal. It's proof that these patterns aren't imagined, exaggerated, or isolated. When people leave comments, they create a visible record that this experience is shared, that others are noticing the same cracks. And if this kind of deep, uncomfortable analysis is valuable to you, analysis that doesn't romanticize cities or soften the truth, take a second to leave a like and subscribe. That's how this conversation stays alive and keeps going deeper. Now that we've established why this silence is dangerous, the next question is even more unsettling. How do systems actually collapse without anyone stopping them? The most unsettling truth about urban collapse is that it rarely looks like collapse while it's happening. Systems don't suddenly shut down. They don't announce failure. They continue operating just enough to appear functional, while internally losing the ability to serve the people who depend on them. This is the invisible mechanism most cities, including New York, fall into, and it's far more dangerous than open crisis. At first, nothing seems broken. Trains still arrive, but less predictably. Offices stay open, but with fewer staff. Services still exist, but accessing them feels harder, slower, more humiliating. Each failure is small, enough to dismiss. Each inconvenience is framed as temporary. People are told to be patient, to adjust, to adapt, and they do, because they have no choice. This is how systemic decay hides. Instead of removing systems, the city stretches them past their limits. Infrastructure built for a different era is forced to absorb more people, more pressure, more complexity, without equivalent investment or renewal. The result isn't a crash, it's fatigue. Chronic structural fatigue embedded into everyday life. What's especially corrosive is how responsibility quietly shifts. When systems weaken, individuals are expected to compensate. Missed a train? Leave earlier. Can't get a doctor's appointment? Call again. Housing process stalled? Hire help. Streets feel unsafe? Stay alert. The city doesn't fix the friction, it teaches people to live with it. Over time, survival skills replace public trust. This produces a psychological shift most people don't consciously notice. Expectations collapse before systems do. People stop asking for better because they stop believing better is possible. Complaints turn into jokes. Frustration turns into resignation. The abnormal becomes routine, and once that happens, the system no longer feels broken. It feels inevitable. Another dangerous illusion is continuity. Because yesterday looks similar to today, people assume tomorrow will too. But erosion isn't linear. It's cumulative. A system weakened in 10 places can fail from pressure in 1. The longer decline goes unaddressed, the more fragile everything becomes beneath the surface. And when failure finally shows itself, it feels sudden, even though the warning signs were everywhere. This is why New York's situation is so deceptive. The city hasn't stopped functioning. It has stopped recovering. Each year adds strain without relief. Each crisis leaves residue that never fully clears. And because collapse isn't loud, it isn't treated as urgent. The real danger isn't that systems are failing. It's that failure has been normalized as the price of living here. And once a city accepts dysfunction as the baseline, it loses the ability to recognize when it's crossed into irreversible territory. Public transportation is supposed to be one of the strongest arguments for urban life. It's the promise that density creates efficiency, that millions of people can move through a city without fear, exhaustion, or constant calculation. In New York, that promise still exists on paper. In reality, transportation has become one of the clearest indicators that the system is no longer designed around human stability, but around endurance. For many residents, the daily commute feels less like mobility and more like exposure. Exposure to unpredictability, exposure to tension, exposure to environments where no one feels fully in control. Trains arrive, but not reliably. Platforms are crowded, but understaffed. Stations function, but feel neglected. Every delay compounds. Stress, because people are already operating with no margin. When a system runs permanently at its limit, even small disruptions feel like personal crises. What's changed isn't just performance, it's perception. The act of moving through the city now requires constant vigilance. People scan platforms instinctively, they adjust body language, they stay alert in ways that drain energy before the day has even started. Transportation stops being neutral infrastructure and becomes an emotional load, carried twice a day, every day. The city rarely frames this as failure. Instead, it's described as complexity, as scale, as inevitability. But the lived experience tells a different story. When a system consistently produces anxiety rather than reliability, it's no longer doing its job. It may still move people physically, but psychologically it does the opposite. It wears them down. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible the cost becomes. No single incident defines the problem. It's the accumulation, the missed connections, the crowded platforms, the sense that no one is fully responsible when something goes wrong. Over time, people internalize the burden. They leave earlier. They plan redundancies. They mentally prepare for failure. The system teaches them not to trust it, and this distrust doesn't stay contained. It spills into how people experience the city as a whole. When movement feels unsafe or exhausting, opportunity shrinks. Social life contracts. Risk, tolerance drops. People stop exploring, stop engaging, stop believing the city is working for them. The urban advantage quietly dissolves. There's another layer most discussions avoid. Transportation stress amplifies every other pressure. Long work hours become heavier. High rent feels more punishing. Health suffers. Relationships strain. The city doesn't just demand productivity, it drains the capacity needed to sustain it. This is how infrastructure failure turns into social fatigue. Yet none of this triggers alarm because trains are still running. The illusion of functionality remains intact, but a system that requires constant emotional armor from its users is already failing, just not in a way that makes headlines. Airports are supposed to represent order, precision, and control. They are the first and last impression of a city, the place where systems are meant to operate at their highest level under pressure. In New York, airports still function. Planes take off, passengers move through terminals, schedules exist. But beneath that surface, they have become quiet mirrors of a city losing its grip on coordination, care, and long-term planning. What travelers experience now isn't a single failure, but a pattern. Endless lines that move without explanation. Security processes that feel understaffed and overstretched. Delays that ripple across entire days. Staff who look exhausted rather than authoritative. Spaces that feel crowded but emotionally empty, where frustration hangs in the air and no one feels accountable for fixing it. Airports no longer feel like gateways. They feel like bottlenecks. This matters because airports concentrate stress in its purest form. People are already vulnerable there. Time matters, money matters, missed connections matter. When systems falter in this environment, the emotional cost multiplies instantly. And in New York, that cost has become routine. Travelers now expect chaos as part of the process. They plan for failure instead of reliability. The abnormal has become standard operating procedure. What's more revealing is what airports say about trust. A functioning airport depends on coordination between dozens of invisible systems: staffing, maintenance, scheduling, security, technology, logistics. When even small cracks appear consistently, it signals something deeper, not a temporary issue, but a system stretched beyond its capacity to self-correct. New York's airports are no longer resilient, they are reactive. There's also a symbolic shift happening. Airports used to reinforce the idea that New York was a global center, efficient, connected, ahead of the curve. Now they quietly undermine that image. Visitors arrive stressed instead of inspired. Residents return home already drained. The city doesn't welcome or send people off with confidence anymore. It absorbs and releases them with friction. And here's the critical point. Airports don't collapse in isolation. They are pressure tests. When they fail repeatedly, it suggests that other systems are being held together by the same fragile balance, just enough to function, not enough to endure. What you see in terminals is what's happening everywhere else, just condensed into a few tense hours. Yet again, there is no alarm, no declaration of crisis, because planes are still flying, because nothing has shut down. But a system doesn't need to stop working to be broken. It only needs to stop improving. And New York's airports stopped improving a long time ago. Housing is the system that determines who is allowed to belong to a city. And in New York, that system no longer functions as shelter or stability. It functions as a sorting mechanism that quietly removes people who can't keep up. There are no eviction sirens, no official announcements, just a slow, procedural push outward, that most don't recognize until it's already happened. At first, it feels manageable. Rent increases slightly. Fees appear where none existed before. Applications demand more documentation, more guarantees, more proof that you deserve to stay. The language is neutral, bureaucratic, almost polite. But the effect is brutal. Each step narrows the funnel. Each requirement excludes another layer of residents who once made the city work. What's striking is how impersonal the process feels. No one tells you that you're being pushed out. The system simply becomes harder to survive. Apartments get smaller, commutes get longer. Living. Arrangements become temporary by default. People delay life decisions, relationships, children, rest, because housing no longer offers a foundation. It offers uncertainty. This is where the illusion of choice becomes dangerous. Outsiders are told that people leave because they want to, that New York simply isn't for everyone, but the reality is more precise and more disturbing. People don't leave because they fail. They leave because the system is designed to extract maximum value while providing minimum security. Housing stops being a human need and becomes a financial instrument optimized for exclusion. The psychological toll is immense. When your home feels conditional, everything else destabilizes. You don't fully unpack. You don't invest emotionally in your neighborhood. You don't plan long-term. You live with the constant awareness that one increase, one disruption, one setback could end your place in the city. That stress compounds silently, day after day, and the city adapts, not by fixing the problem, but by reframing it. Luxury development is presented as progress. Scarcity is marketed as prestige. Density is blamed instead of policy choices. The narrative shifts responsibility away from systems and onto individuals. If you can't afford to stay, the implication is clear. You were never meant to. But this erosion doesn't just affect those who leave. It hollows out the city itself. Communities fragment. Institutional memory disappears. Essential workers vanish from the places they serve. The city becomes less resilient, less humane, less real, even as it becomes more expensive. The most dangerous part is how normal this has become. Conversations about housing are now framed as personal finance problems, not systemic failures. Survival is individualized. Collective solutions fade, and the expulsion continues, quietly, efficiently, without outrage. Public healthcare systems don't usually fail in spectacular ways. They fail quietly, through saturation, delay, and emotional exhaustion. And New York is deep into that phase. Hospitals are open, clinics are operating, emergency rooms are staffed. On paper, the system exists. In practice, it is running in a permanent state of overload that strips it of its most important function, providing timely, humane care. The first sign isn't collapse, it's waiting. Waiting weeks for appointments, waiting hours in emergency rooms, waiting for test results, waiting for callbacks that never come. Time becomes the currency patients pay with, and the cost is not abstract. It's pain prolonged, anxiety intensified, conditions worsened simply because the system cannot respond fast enough. What makes this especially damaging is that healthcare is where urban stress accumulates. Transportation pressure, housing instability, financial strain, all of it eventually lands in the body. But the system meant to absorb that pressure has no buffer left. Doctors are rushed. Nurses are burned out. Administrative layers multiply while human attention shrinks. Care becomes transactional, not relational. There's also a silent triage happening. Not official, not acknowledged, but real. Those who know how to navigate bureaucracy, who have flexible jobs, who can advocate aggressively for themselves, move forward. Everyone else stalls. Access doesn't disappear. It stratifies. Health becomes another domain where inequality is experienced daily, not as ideology, but as delay and dismissal. And yet none of this triggers panic because nothing has technically failed. People are still treated. Emergencies are still handled. But a system that only works at the edge of crisis is not a functioning system. It's a reactive one. It cannot heal. It can only contain damage. The emotional cost is profound. When people stop trusting that care will arrive when needed, they delay seeking help. They minimize symptoms. They endure longer than they should. This creates a feedback loop where problems grow more severe, more expensive, more traumatic, reinforcing the very overload that caused the delay in the first place. What's most revealing is how normalized this has become. Long waits are expected. Burnout is assumed. Detachment is rationalized as efficiency. The city accepts a version of healthcare that would have been unthinkable a generation ago and calls it reality instead of decline. There was a time when signs of neglect triggered immediate concern. Overflowing trash, broken. Sidewalks, malfunctioning public spaces, these were signals that something was wrong. In New York today, those same signs barely register. Not because they've disappeared, but because they've been absorbed into the visual and psychological background of daily life. This is where decline becomes most dangerous, when dysfunction stops shocking. Sanitation and basic maintenance are not just aesthetic services. They are signals of collective care. When streets feel dirty, when public spaces feel unmanaged, when decay lingers without response, the message is subtle but powerful. No one is really in charge anymore. Responsibility is diffused. Accountability evaporates. And people adjust their expectations downward without realizing it. What's striking is how quickly this normalization happens. At first, people complain. Then they joke. Then they stop mentioning it at all. A broken escalator becomes always broken. Trash piles become just how this block is. Public bathrooms become places to avoid entirely. Each small concession trains residents to accept less, to demand less, to tolerate conditions that would once have been unacceptable. This tolerance has consequences beyond cleanliness. When environments deteriorate, behavior changes. People disengage. They stop protecting shared spaces. They move faster, care less, withdraw emotionally. The city becomes something to endure rather than something to participate in. Social trust erodes not through conflict, but through neglect. There's also a deeper psychological shift at play. Disorder creates low-level stress that never fully turns off. It signals unpredictability. It tells people that systems are unreliable, that comfort is temporary, that vigilance is necessary. Over time, this background stress compounds with every other pressure of urban life, leaving people chronically tense without a clear source to point to. The city often frames this as a resource issue. Too big, too complex, too expensive to maintain perfectly. But perfection isn't the expectation. Care is. And what's disappearing isn't cleanliness alone, but the visible effort to maintain dignity in shared life. When that effort fades, so does the sense of belonging. Perhaps the most unsettling part is how easily this decay hides in plain sight. Visitors may notice it briefly. Residents barely register it anymore. And that gap, between what should feel alarming and what feels normal, is the clearest indicator that a system has crossed into quiet decline. Security is one of those systems people only notice when it's missing. In New York, it hasn't vanished. It has thinned. The city still has police, cameras, lighting, patrols. But what's eroding is the feeling of being protected rather than merely monitored. And that distinction changes how people move, think, and exist in public space. For many residents, safety has become situational instead of structural. People plan routes more carefully. They adjust schedules. They avoid certain places at certain times. None of this is framed as fear. It's framed as being smart. But when constant calculation becomes necessary, it signals that the system is no longer doing its job fully. Individuals are compensating for gaps they shouldn't have to manage. What makes this especially corrosive is the ambiguity. There isn't a single narrative of danger. Some areas feel fine, others feel tense. The unpredictability itself becomes the threat. People can't rely on consistent standards of safety, so they stay alert everywhere. That vigilance drains energy and erodes trust, even when nothing overtly happens. The city often responds by pointing to data, to selective metrics, to reassurance that things are under control. But lived experience doesn't operate on charts. It operates on feeling. When people stop making eye contact, move faster, or hesitate before entering shared spaces, something fundamental has shifted, regardless of what statistics say. There's also a subtle social cost. When public spaces feel uncertain, they stop functioning as places of connection. People retreat inward. Streets become corridors, not meeting points. The city loses its informal social fabric, the small interactions that make urban life feel alive rather than hostile. Safety in this sense isn't just about crime prevention. It's about whether people feel they belong outside their private bubbles. Perhaps most revealing is how this erosion is discussed. Conversations about safety are polarized, politicized, and quickly shut down. That dynamic prevents honest assessment. If you name the problem, you're accused of exaggeration. If you ignore it, you normalize risk. The result is paralysis. A city aware of its discomfort, but unable to address it openly. This is what happens when security becomes performative rather than protective. Systems remain visible, but their effectiveness fades. And residents quietly adapt to a lower standard of collective safety without ever being asked if they consented to it. Every system we've talked about so far shares one common feature. None of them have fully collapsed. And that is exactly why the most powerful force holding New York together right now isn't resilience. It's denial. Collective, institutional, cultural denial. The unspoken agreement to act as if what's happening is temporary, manageable, or simply the cost of being a world-class city. Denial works because it's comfortable. Admitting. Decline would require admitting failure, not just of policies or management, but of identity. New York isn't just a city, it's an idea, a symbol of ambition, success, possibility. Questioning its functionality feels like questioning the story people have built their lives around, so discomfort gets reframed. Stress becomes part of the hustle. Exhaustion becomes the price of opportunity. This reframing doesn't happen accidentally. It's reinforced by media narratives, institutional language, and cultural pride. Problems are isolated, minimized, or explained away as anomalies. Attention shifts quickly. Nothing is allowed to sit long enough to provoke structural reckoning. The city remains in motion, which creates the illusion that it's still progressing. What makes denial so dangerous is that it freezes response. When a problem is never fully acknowledged, it can never be fully addressed. Instead of repair, you get coping mechanisms. Instead of reform, you get messaging. And instead of solutions, you get normalization. Over time, the gap between reality and narrative widens, and people live in that gap. There's also a social cost to speaking honestly. Those who name the decline are often dismissed as pessimistic, ungrateful, or out of touch. The pressure to perform optimism becomes another invisible system, one that discourages truth in favor of stability. Silence becomes a survival strategy. This collective denial doesn't just protect institutions, it protects routines. It allows life to continue without difficult questions, but it also guarantees that when failure finally becomes undeniable, it will feel sudden and overwhelming, because preparation was postponed for too long. New York hasn't lost the ability to function. It has lost the willingness to confront itself, and that, more than any broken system, is what puts it at real risk. When multiple public systems weaken at the same time, the danger isn't that the city suddenly stops functioning. It's that everyday life quietly stops making sense. This is the stage New York is approaching now. Transportation strains compound housing stress. Healthcare overload amplifies mental exhaustion. Public space neglect reinforces insecurity. None of these failures exist alone. They stack, they interact. And together, they create a city that technically works, but no longer works for the people living in it. At this point, decline stops being abstract. It becomes logistical. Simple tasks require planning, buffers, contingencies. A missed train affects a medical appointment. A housing issue affects work stability. An unsafe public space changes movement patterns. Life becomes a series of calculated risks rather than organic choices. The city demands constant optimization from its residents just to maintain baseline functioning. This is the true meaning of systemic collapse in modern cities. Not riots, not ruins, but exhaustion so deep that people stop imagining alternatives. When all systems strain simultaneously, there is no recovery time, no reset. Every day starts with less capacity than the one before. Burnout becomes structural. What's especially alarming is how quickly this condition becomes invisible. People adapt their expectations downward. They redefine survival as success. Leaving the city becomes framed as personal failure rather than rational response. Staying becomes proof of toughness, even as quality of life erodes. The city keeps its population not through opportunity, but through inertia and identity. And this is where the American dream narrative finally breaks. A dream assumes upward movement, but when systems no longer support growth, ambition turns into self-extraction. People give more while receiving less. Time, health, relationships, all traded for the right to remain in a city that no longer reciprocates. New York will not announce this moment. There will be no official acknowledgement that the city has crossed a threshold. It will simply become harder to live here without understanding why. Harder to rest, harder to plan, harder to feel anchored. And by the time enough people recognize what's happening, the systems will be too intertwined and too degraded to fix quickly.